So hi again, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important discussion, which is a call for the immediate release of detained human rights defenders and other prisoners of conscience. It will also include the role of international mechanisms, including the UN, in putting pressure on the Bahraini government. So I'm your moderator today. My name is Saloua, and I'm working with the BCHR since the Arab Spring protest in 2011. BCHR has since led a relentless advocacy campaign for the release of detained human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience, such as Abdulhadi al-Khawaja. The importance of the discussion today lies in that it has now been over 11 years since the uprising, with no significant developments concerning the release of HRDs and prisoners of conscience. This creates an emergency to discuss any new strategies of advocacy that will enable the process of release. I will start by introducing our distinguished 5 speakers today in the order they will speak. So first we have Ahmed Alwadaei from the Bird Institute for Rights and Democracy. Ahmed is a Bahraini activist currently living in exile in the UK. He was forced to flee Bahrain after being arrested in 2011 for taking part in the Arab Spring protests. In 2015, he had his citizenship revoked and was rendered stateless. As a consequence, his family has been subjected to human rights violations such as arbitrary detention, unfair trial, and torture. Second, we have Shea, who is the Bahrain researcher at the Human Rights Watch. She has previously worked for the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Third, we have Sima Watling. She's a campaigner. At Amnesty International since 1998 and has covered all Gulf countries as well as Iran and Iraq. Her portfolio has in the last 10 years been focused on Bahrain. Fourth, we have Joshua Colangelo Bryan, who's a board member of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. He's off counsel with Dorsey and Whitley LLP, which is an international law firm. He handles criminal matters and complex civil litigation. What's impressive is that he devotes a substantial portion of his practice to pro bono matters, such as the representation of Guantanamo Bay detainees and as a consultant to Human Rights Watch. And he has also done humanitarian work before joining the law firm. Last but not least, we have Sara Brandt, who is the advocacy lead on the Free Al-Khawaja campaign, where she works together with the Al-Khawaja family for his release. In the last 4 years, she has been policy advisor policy advisor and coordinator for the Global Focus, which is the Danish leading platform for civil society, leading the work on civic space. So without further ado, I'm gonna give the word to Ahmed, our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Saloua, for your kind introduction, and much appreciation also to the organizers, the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and the other organizations who endorsed this important event. I wanted to start by talking about like how difficult and how challenging is the situation of the human rights defenders in the country. And I wanted to start with 2011 events that has led to the imprisonment of the most prominent human rights defenders. And in this context, it was the case of Abdulhadi al-Khawaja or Abdul Jalil al-Sengais, the real crime that is happening to them right now is that the fact that for taking a part in pro-democracy protests, they are punished with life sentences, and they are continue to be subjected to a deliberate denial of medical treatment. They face extremely difficult prison conditions. And it's also like it's about like how much attention these individuals, after 11 years or 12 years of a struggle, people move on, the world move on to concentrate on other things. But these individuals would be left behind to suffer and to face these issues. I wanted to start by really talking about an incident that happened yesterday. As a matter of fact, it was a call I received from a senior religious figure, Sheikh Abdul Muqdad, who was sentenced to life imprisonment along with the Sengis and Al Khawaja. Al Muqdad spoke about an incident happened to him yesterday. He meant to be going out for a medical treatment, medical appointment. And at Joe prison, where they located, is an officer said to him, the doctor is not there. So then he said, why would I have to then to leave the prison if the doctor is not there? A doctor is not going to see me, so there is no point of leaving there. Then he was pushed and was asked that he should be signing a confirmation to say that I'm refusing medical treatment. So I'm not refusing medical treatment. All was happening with me is that I'm not gonna be seeing a doctor. So he refused to sign this. They get violent. They started to 4 or 5 police officers attempted to physically assault him. Others stopped them. He was verbally assaulted. And when he spoke to me, I could feel like the sadness, the anger, the injustice in his voice, like a man in his 60s to be treated like this. Maybe the world moved on the sacrifices these individuals went through in 2011. Maybe there was some attention back into the uprisings. I remember those days when they were greeted at the Pearl Roundabout, the focal point of the protest movement in the country, as champions, as the stars of the movement. They were on the stage. People were cheering their slogans. These are like the leaders of the pro-democracy movement in the country. And the crackdown that they went, like the crackdown they're going through, whether it's from the military court or through like the episodes of torture, they continue to be suffering from those events in 2011. Many of them continue to suffer from injuries resulted in torture when they were arrested. And now, if you want to just to understand the role of a human rights defender, it's individuals like Abdul Hadi Khawaja, who's going to tell you, this individual is not subjected. Abdul Muqdad is not subjected to medical negligence. The truth is, they are facing a slow death. If a man in this age, in this fragile condition, and you treat them like this, what do you expect? So this is an extremely worrisome situation that human rights defenders in the country face. And I wanted to say a second case, which is also like extremely serious and worrying. It's the case of Abdul Jalil Sengis, who has been on solid food strike, refusing to take any solid food since July last year. This is again a subject to humiliation. It was triggered due to humiliation. It was triggered due to confiscation of his manuscripts, a research he was working on for 4 years, and was confiscated arbitrarily by the prison authorities. As Sengis declared his hunger strike and stated that I will refuse to eat solid food until my research, my manuscripts handed over to my family. There is no progress whatsoever on his case. The authorities continue to find the justification after a justification to deny him his rights. And time to time, he would be like, despite he's being currently placed in a medical facility at the Kano Medical Center, but he has been subjected to deliberate medical negligence. Or this is a place where you're supposed to be in a medical facility, but still you don't get your medication in time. You don't get the right diagnosis. You don't get the right X-rays or like MRIs or whatever diagnosis, despite even if they are being reported or requested by the doctor who would examine you. So this is really an extremely distressing situation of those individuals, and the human rights defenders not only subjected to ongoing imprisonment, but there are also like other tactics which Bahrain would use. Individuals like myself would be stripped of their citizenship. I'm currently a stateless person. This statelessness could also impact my family. Like I had a child which was born a stateless child, because Bahrain again would not recognize that women can pass citizenship to their children. It's only through the father, and if the father is a stateless person, then their children will be in a legal limbo. The Bahrain would use other tactics to silence voices, and I have family members which currently imprisoned. My cousin, my brother-in-law, Sayyid Alwadaei, is currently facing 11 years conviction, imprisonment, which the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention would declare it to be arbitrary and reprisals for my activism. This last week alone, we have seen or 2 weeks ago, we have seen the report by the UN Secretary General on reprisals mandate. It has named the very same individuals I mentioned, the case of Abdel Sengais or Hassan Mushayma or Abdelhad al-Khawaja. The other tactics which they used against activists is the surveillance. Pegasus is now a weapon to be used against those activists, and myself being subjected to this. Ibtisam al-Sayed, another leading female rights defender, is subjected to similar tactic. So it's from surveillance to citizenship verification to imprisonment. These are the available tools that the Bahraini regime believe that they can use and deploy against the human rights defenders. And when it comes into international mechanisms, while we appreciate and note the report by the Secretary General, but what we've seen in that report is a denial by the Bahraini government. There is no even any level whatsoever of acknowledgement of there is an issue. And at the same time, Bahrain is going to be running for the Human Rights Council election for next year. These countries, when they refuse to allow special rapporteurs access to the country, when UN officials are not able to visit the prison facilities, when Bahrain uses the Human Rights Council as a mechanism or as a tool to say, we have a human rights paradise in Bahrain. This is the issue here we're facing, is when these countries face, there will be zero consequences on committing serious crimes, torture, unfair trials, ongoing imprisonment for over a decade, and then they get away with all of this. This is why there should be into the tools that would hold these states in the account, and if there is anything, they should not be offered a seat at the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sayed, for highlighting the ongoing violations in Bahrain and the appalling conditions under which the detainees and prisoners are held. And it has indeed been way too long, 11 years, more than 11 years. And the international community can no longer stay silent. We will now move on to our next speaker, Shea from the Human Rights Watch. There you go, Joey.
First and foremost, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this very important event. So I'm going to talk very broadly about the strategy of Human Rights Watch and other international human rights organizations and grassroots organizations in our approach to advocating for the release of imprisoned human rights defenders and activists in Bahrain and more broadly. I'm also going to talk about one case study of a push we're doing recently for the release of Abdelhadi al-Khawaja. I won't go in too much detail because I know my colleague Sara will be speaking about that campaign later. And finally, I want to talk about the sort of long-term perennial challenges that face human rights advocacy in general, but how this is particularly acute when we are advocating for the release of imprisoned human rights defenders. So first and foremost, the strategy of Human Rights Watch in our approach to HRDs in Bahrain is fundamentally documenting cases and the conditions of detention of these individuals, and the use of this documentation to publicize these cases to the Bahraini government and to the population more broadly speaking. And unfortunately, in the case of so many imprisoned human rights defenders in Bahrain, we have been documenting the same cases now for over a decade. But we, must continue to counter the narrative of the state, which is sort of perpetuating the abuses against these individuals with facts, and sort of push back against the denials of the Bahraini government, which are, used as a tactic to silence human rights defenders who are not in prison and other organizations. And so, particularly, as Saeed mentioned, Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, Abdul Al-Singrais have been imprisoned for over a decade. They have lost a decade of their lives simply for exercising their fundamental rights and freedoms, their right to freedom of association, peaceful expression, and assembly. And these and many others in Bahrain are serving life terms following manifestly unfair trials. And, of course, these individuals have been imprisoned for over a decade, but I think it's also important, to mention that individuals in Bahrain are continuously arrested for for freedom of expression and assembly related charges. So between June 2020 and May 2021, Bahraini authorities have allegedly arrested at least 58 people for their online activity. So it's not that these arrests and imprisonments happened 10 years ago and continue today, but it's an ongoing form of repression. And as Saeed rightly pointed out, it's not just that these individuals were subject to manifestly unfair trials a decade ago, but their rights are continuously violated in terms of their conditions of imprisonment and, lack of access to adequate medical attention, overcrowded prisons, torture in some cases as well. So at Human Rights Watch and many other organizations, we use this documentation to fundamentally name and shame the Bahraini government and its allies to pressure them into changing their behavior. And our advocates sort of take the facts that I document, put them into a narrative and make a strategy. And of course, our sort of first and foremost advocacy target in the context of Bahrain is the Bahraini government. And, there's a question of after why over 10 years of this documentation and advocacy, so many of these human rights defenders are still imprisoned. And, of course, that's there are many different reasons for that, but, the Bahraini government can and seems to be sort of impervious in many ways to public shaming directly from human rights organizations. And as we've seen, these individuals have lost a decade of their lives. They've been subject to further abuses despite our attempts to document their cases and publicize them. So in this context, we also have to and are engaging the allies of the Bahraini government. So mainly the US, the UK, the EU. And it's not because these states, have a very strong records of human rights themselves, but it's mainly because they have significant security and strategic investments and therefore leverage over the Bahraini government. So it's our job to sort of get these allies of Bahrain to engage the Bahraini government and express their concerns over human rights abuses privately, but most importantly, publicly. Because, as the case of Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, who is, a dual Bahraini-Danish citizen, the Danish government has, been saying for over a decade that they are engaging with the Bahraini government privately, but obviously this has not resulted in his release. And so in our sort of like naming and shaming toolkit, most importantly, we have to get these allies of the Bahraini government to publicly come out and condemn their abuses and advocate for the release of these imprisoned human rights defenders. And, it's really difficult. Sara will certainly go into the details of the Al-Khawaja campaign, but these, sustained public pressure campaigns are incredibly challenging. They take so much coordination between different organizations, individuals, time, effort, money, resources, and they have to be sustained over a long period of time. If we look at the case of Ala Abdel Fattah in Egypt, this case has been very active and public, and his family has been very adept at using the media to bring awareness to his case, and he still remains to be in prison. He still remains in prison. So, I think it's, of course, we're going to rely on our traditional tools and in our toolbox of public advocacy, but I think it's also important to recognize that the challenge of these campaigns and the sustained effort that they need. I think particularly in the case of Abdelhadi al-Khawaja, there is, a bit of space, sort of particularly coming up given the Bahraini elections in November. There's potentially going to be, more media focus on Bahrain over the next few months. So there's an opening to create more pressure. But even beyond that, it will be important for us as human rights organizations and sort of broader network to make sure that pressure and media outreach is sustained over a long period of time. And yeah, I guess I'll just close with saying that, the challenges are very real. I think particularly this year, if we look at sort of the aftermath of, Russia's war on Ukraine and how that has changed the international landscape and the willingness of Bahrain's allies to criticize Bahrain and the Gulf more broadly. And I think if we look at Biden's disastrous trip to Saudi Arabia in July, and sort of what that did to undermine the narrative of a human rights-centered foreign policy, I definitely think that, it's going to be an uphill battle for our organizations to create this sort of sustained support on, the UK, the US, and other European countries to pressure the Bahraini government. Again, we obviously, need to go full force, but I think it's important just to keep in mind that if it's been an uphill battle in the past, it's going to, be even more difficult in the coming months.
Thank you, Joey, for highlighting the Human Rights Watch strategy and for bringing up the important question of why, after a decade of documentation and advocacy work, we are still seeing ongoing human rights violations in Bahrain, and giving us examples of how we can sustain the work that is already being done and what else we can do in the future. I'll give the word to Sima Watling now. Sima.
Well, thank you very much for organizing this event and for having me on this panel. At the risk of repeating and reiterating what my colleagues have just said, I will just go through my little presentation, but clearly it will come to the same conclusions. 11 years after the popular uprising that rocked Bahrain, and beneath the fanfare and subsequent reform, prisoners of conscience, including some arrested during the protests, remain behind bar, and the rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly continue to be suppressed in Bahrain. 11 years on, the authorities have succeeded in shutting down any space for the peaceful exercise of the right to freedom of expression or peaceful activism. And rather than addressing the drivers of the protest, Bahraini authorities outlawed the main political parties and social groups, including groups that sought government licensing, were legally recognized, and had dialogue with the government until 2011. At the same time, underrepresentation of Shia in government, one of the grievances raised by the 2011 protesters, remain entrenched. Prior to the 2011 uprising, Amnesty International was already documenting the situation in Bahrain, decrying the human rights violations, including those suffered by a number of those who are still imprisoned today for their rights to freedom of expression and assembly. The authorities do not want to break this cycle. And they remain steadfast in their position. They portray themselves as embracing reforms, and allied governments choose to believe them. Today, on the cusp of parliamentary elections in the country, from which opposition voices will be absent, as there is not one opposition political leader of national stature left who has not been detained or imprisoned. And 11 years on from the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, the BK report, which set out the recommendations the Bahraini government publicly committed itself to implementing, and ahead of the Bahrain Universal Periodic Review in November, and 10 years on from when Bahrain accepted more than 140 of the 176 key UPR recommendations, including those calling for the release of prisoners of conscience. Here we are again, reiterating the same calls for prisoners of conscience to be released immediately and unconditionally, including Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, Abdul Jalil al-Singas, and Sheikh Ali Salman. Would it not be easier for the Bahraini authorities, and would it not make them more credible in their effort to show the world that their reform efforts are truthful, if in the meantime they at least handed back Abdul Jalil al-Singas' writing to his family, and then he would stop his hunger strike? Or if Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja received adequate medical attention and rehabilitation? These are simple acts or actions that would go towards us believing more into Bahrain's so-called reforms or positive changes. The Bahraini authorities may think that with time we will get tired of repeating these calls, or that people will get tired of hearing the same calls. Yes, it is a challenge to keep the cases alive when very little change happens and there is no longer legal recourse for these cases. But we owe it to these courageous people not to be silent, to continue to seek accountability for the human rights violations they have suffered and still are suffering. We are a glimmer of hope, and our work ensures that still things do not change. Sorry. We are a glimmer of hope, and our hopes ensures that even if things do not change immediately, we are shedding the truth about them and bearing witness to the injustice they endure. Well, as Bahrain continues to repress dissent, to imprison opposition activists, to refuse to implement its promises to release them, as per recommendations it has accepted, allies around the world and UN member states must take stronger and louder action and hold Bahrain accountable for contravening its legal undertakings as signatory to international human rights instruments and for failing to abide by its obligations. As Joey highlighted, we continue to work, we issue urgent action, we make public statements, we issue press releases. The difficulty is keeping this momentum going when so much is happening around the world. Again, the crisis in Ukraine, the war on Ukraine, and the need for all our countries in Europe to for what the Gulf countries can offer makes these countries running towards Bahrain, towards the UAE, etc., seeking help for their gas and for their commodities. This is very difficult it makes it difficult to compete with these needs, these basic needs as well for these countries. But as champions for human rights and freedoms, they also must not forget what is happening under their nose in Bahrain. And for this, we will continue to call for the release of prisoners of conscience in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you, Sima, for also highlighting the current challenges that we're facing, especially considering the political situation in Europe at the moment with the Ukraine war, for example. Let us now hear from Joshua.
Thank you very much. Perhaps it's being a lawyer, but I think that even as we talk about what to do going forward, it's important to remind people about the legal process by which the human rights defenders and other prisoners of conscience who we're talking about today ended up in jail. And it's critical to remember that these people were not imprisoned for doing anything that could be remotely described as criminal. Instead, they were locked up purely for political reasons. Now, you don't need to believe me. You don't need to take my word for that. Instead, all you need to do is look at the words of the Bahraini courts that dealt with these criminal cases. In particular, there was one prosecution that led to the conviction of the people who've been mentioned today and many other prominent individuals. That arose from the massive pro-democracy protests that began in February 2011 at the Pearl Roundabout. And the case involved 21 people who were said to be members of a group called, scandalously, Coalition for a Republic. The case began in military courts, not civilian courts, military courts that had been established in March of 2011. One of the people charged, who's been mentioned today many times, was Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, an internationally known human rights activist. The military court found that he had attended meetings of the Coalition for a Republic. He had communicated with the press about the situation in Bahrain, and he had, quote, described symbols of the regime in disparaging ways, close quote. Essentially, the court sentenced Abdulhadi to life in prison for going to meetings and expressing his views. Another individual who was part of that case, Hassan Mushema, a longtime opposition figure, was found by the military court to have created a group, quote, based on the principle of the legitimacy of truth, not the legitimacy of law, close quote. He was also found to have given interviews to the media about events in Bahrain, and it was said that he had called on people to promote, quote, the establishment of a democratic republic, close quote. So the court sentenced Hassan Mushema to life in prison for using classic tools of peaceful protest in order to call for democracy in Bahrain. One more example I'll offer. Abdul Ghani Al-Khanjar, a longtime human rights activist. Along with the others, he was charged with joining this group, which the government said had been established in violation of the law to call for a republic. And he was also charged and found to have attempted to overthrow the government by force. Obviously, overthrowing a government by force sounds like a very dramatic idea. People write books and make movies about that kind of thing. So what was the evidence that he had engaged in that kind of dramatic activity? Well, there was a computer and 2 hard drives that he supposedly owned. Now, of course, you could have a detailed plan for a violent overthrow of a government on a computer. But according to prosecutors, these devices had, and I'll quote again, political papers, including a file that contained a critical review of the Constitution and some laws, close quote. So it wasn't a plan to storm government buildings, it was a legal analysis. Now, someone who has a lot of the legal analysis on his computer, I can assure you that's not nearly enough to overthrow a government. Nonetheless, Al-Khanjar was given a 15-year sentence in absentia. Eventually, the military courts were dissolved and the civilian Court of Cassation, Bahrain's highest court, heard an appeal from these defendants. It affirmed all of the convictions on the basis of the same factual findings. Again, it's really important that we pay attention to the actual words of the Bahraini court. The court found that the Coalition for a Republic was established with the goal of creating a democracy, which in the court's view was illegal in and of itself. In other words, the court said that calling for democracy, calling for a republic was simply prohibited by law and a crime. Now, the court recognized that the crime of terrorism, which was the top charge for many defendants, requires that some force be used. Remarkably, the court said force doesn't have to entail, quote, the use of weapons. Instead, force can be exercised in other actions, such as organizing and leading popular demonstrations as a tool to pressure the government, close quote. In another section, the court said that terrorism is, quote, realized in all means of moral pressure. It is certainly a novel interpretation of the law to say that applying moral pressure through nonviolence is terrorism. And in fact, it's not only a novel or new idea, there is no legitimate basis in law for that. Obviously, if exercising moral pressure or demonstrating nonviolently to pressure a government to become more democratic is criminal, how could anyone ever voice opposition to any government policy? Now, again, this case was decided many years ago, but remains entirely relevant. First, because the people who were sentenced to life in prison remain in jail today simply for the fact that they wanted democracy in Bahrain. Second, as we've heard from some of our speakers, it's not as if things are improving in Bahraini courts. There's a report that will be released shortly by Human Rights Watch looking at the use of the death penalty in Bahrain. People not simply sentenced to life in prison, but sentenced to be executed. And there's been a significant increase in that over the last 10 years. The report describes how many of these cases are based on confessions that the defendants allege were coerced, where there often is medical evidence to support those allegations, and where courts simply ignore them. So not only have things not improved, if anything, it's getting worse. For all these reasons, GCHR, as well as the other groups who are represented here today, will be continuing to work for the release of these prisoners of conscience, including human rights defenders, and we'll do that for as long as necessary. Thanks very much. And I think you're still on mute, Saloua.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you, Joshua, for giving us your legal perspective on which legal framework has been used in Bahrain to detain and imprison these human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience. Finally, we have Sara Brandt, our final speaker today. Sara Brandt, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and big thank you to Gulf Center for Human Rights for inviting me here today. So when I was contacted by Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja's family a while back to ask if I was interested in working on this case with them full-time for 3 months, obviously the answer was yes, right away. I think Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja's case, which is what we've heard from several speakers here today, is such an important case. And 11 and a half years later, he's still in prison after having been part of peaceful protests during the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. And he is one of the most prominent human rights defenders in the region, and he's so inspiring for everyone. And so I'm really Happy that I'm able to spend all of my time on calling for his release. And what we've heard from other speakers, this is not an easy task, but I think the solidarity and the support that we're seeing from organizations and allies all over the world is really overwhelming and amazing. And it just comes to show how much of an inspiration and an impact that Abdul Hadi has really had on so many people's lives and organizations around the world. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's part of the Free Al-Khawaja campaign that we're doing at the moment, and hopefully will last for a long time. So I will just share my screen now. This is just to show you a little bit of the visuals that we have for the campaign. I'm unsure whether this is the correct one. 1 second. I will just do this. All right, so I hope you can see my screen. Okay, maybe not. You know what? I will do it without the visuals. It is no problem. All right, so what I was going to share with you is some visuals that we've had done for the Free Al-Khawaja campaign, because what is clear is that so many people in organizations around the world have really been working for his release now for 11.5 years, and they've done amazing work. And so what we're here to do in this campaign, hashtag Free Al-Khawaja, is not to invent everything from the beginning and to try and do everything from the beginning. It is really to build on all of this amazing work that people are already doing. And so the Free Al-Khawaja hashtag is sort of bringing together all of that work that has been done, whether it's in Geneva, New York, the US, with the US government in DC, with the EU, in Ireland, and so many other places around the world. And so what we're doing in this campaign is basically to bring together all of those people to do it jointly. And what I'm really happy to say is that we've seen some positive developments over the last week, where we've had UN Special Rapporteur Mary Lawler come out and criticize the Danish government for not doing enough for Abdul Hadi's release. And basically the backstory is that what we've seen the Danish government doing for the last 11.5 years is that they have been behind closed doors, doing silent diplomacy, asking the Bahraini government to release Al-Khawaja, but towards the public, if, for example, you look at the Facebook page for the Danish embassy in Riyadh, you see that Denmark and Bahrain have amazing relations, and they're focusing on economics and security and all of these different things that they're happy to be collaborating on. And there's no word towards the public on the need for the release of Abdul Hadi. And he is the only Danish human rights defender imprisoned in the world at the moment. And so it's really sad that the Danish government is not doing more publicly. What they are doing, however, and we've seen this at the Human Rights Council session that is ongoing now, is that they have been calling for his release and raising the case under item 4, for example, and that's of course great. And this is a strategy that we've seen from the Danish government, that they have been bringing the case forward at the UN, especially at the Human Rights Council sessions, the UPR, but also at the EU, and also at the UN General Assembly and other places, which is great. But we have also seen is in previous cases, whether it is the release of his daughter, Mariam Al-Khawaja, or his other daughter, Zainab Al-Khawaja, that when they were released, it was a combination of silent diplomacy and public pressure for his release directly towards the Bahrain, or for their release directly towards the Bahraini government. And so for this reason, our very clear message together with Mary Lawler and others is that Denmark needs to apply direct public pressure. towards the Bahraini government. And what we're really happy to see also, which has just happened within this past week, is that several Danish prominent politicians are supporting the criticism from Mary Lawler. Specifically, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Martin Lidegaard, is now out saying, we have seen for 11 years that the current strategy of the government is not working. And so what we need to happen now is to change that strategy to do public pressure and criticism on the government of Bahrain. So we're hoping that this campaign is really bringing some push for the Danish government to lead the public efforts for his release. Obviously, they can't stand alone, and that's also why it's amazing to have other organizations and experts and actors in other countries that are working closely with other governments to stand side by side with the Danish government to call for his release. We really need all the attention that we can get on the case. One of the things that we keep mentioning is that 11 years are 11 years too many for being in prison for peaceful protest. And so we hope that you would all like to join in on the campaign. You can help us by sharing the social media posts and calling for his release. It is the hashtag #FreeAlKhawaja. And you're welcome to check out Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok. And I would like to really encourage you to take part in that, because what we need at the moment is for the Bahraini government to be as annoyed as possible, because because so many around the world are calling for the release of Abdul Hadi, but of course also the other prisoners of conscience that also need to be released from Bahrain. So we believe that together we can make it happen, but it is a long battle. But I think with all the efforts combined, hopefully we can be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara, for your inputs and for giving us the positive developments that you have seen in the Al-Khawaja campaign. Now, before going into the concluding remarks from our speakers, I would like to go into the Q&A, question and answers session before doing that. The first question would be to all the speakers, going from where we are now and into the upcoming months, what leverage does the upcoming UPR and elections in Bahrain give us in our strategy for advocacy? Said Ahmed, would you like to say something about that? Or anyone else?
I can quickly jump in. So I think for the UPR and for the elections, I sort of mentioned this, but it's an opportunity that Bahrain will be in the media spotlight. And just given its, sort of larger neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, there are not as many opportunities, for Bahrain to really be in the global spotlight that we can then leverage, to use that to, help promote whatever advocacy aims we may have. So the release of human rights defenders, the repeal of certain abusive laws. And so I think like the increased media spotlights and international attention, not just media, but also diplomatically as well, presents an opportunity for advocacy and movement around these elections. If Bahrain wants to have these, public statements from its allies, allied other states in support of the elections, then they also have a responsibility to make sure that the elections are conducted freely and fairly and inclusively, and all eligible voters are allowed to participate, and opposition members are not imprisoned. So yeah, I think it's the media attention and also the diplomatic attention as well that's given that provides us for an opportunity to help pressure Bahrain's allies into raising human rights concerns, raising concerns potentially over certain violations that may occur over the election period.
Thank you, Joey. Does anyone else have an input?
Can I come in?
Sarah, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. No, I agree very much with Joey on the opportunities around the elections and the UPR coming up. We also are saying that hopefully the Bahraini government will listen more to public pressure and care about their international image prior to elections. Hopefully we will not have actors such as the EU and the US and others go out and congratulate them on a successful open election, but hopefully we could really use this opportunity to put pressure on the Bahraini government to say that if you really want to be in a direction of democracy and human rights, one of the steps you could take would be to release human rights defenders imprisoned. And so we are asking governments to do that, and we really hope that it will be a momentum to raise that. And then obviously the UPR of Bahrain is also an important opportunity where governments can hopefully draw attention to these violations that are happening, in particular calling for the release of imprisoned human rights defenders.
Thank you, Sara. Sima, you can go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I would like also to add that as all the eyes are converging on Bahrain, of course, Bahrain is going to carry on its own narrative, but this is an opportunity for us to counter this narrative and pass our message and calling for these releases and showing, and we have all the documentation as you know, and the knowledge to counter this narrative and prove what we are saying, based on research and documentation and monitoring and all that. Yes, Bahrain will at that moment try to even project an even better image of itself, and now is the time to be able to say, hold on a second, you're all agreeing and getting cozy with Bahrain, but this is the reality. And if it makes you accomplices of Bahrain, if you do not take actions and demand accountability, or at least for change, request this change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sima. So we have time for one last question. Which is, what are your thoughts on the alternative sentencing reform that Bahrain extended, and how it can be used in putting pressure for the release of human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience?
Hi, I'm happy to take this.
Yes, okay. I thought about you actually.
Thank you so much. To be honest, this is a quite interesting question, because part of what we call it Bahrain package of reform is that they have now alternative sentence, and even every statement that they would make, even including by the foreign minister in New York, just I think it was last week, he was citing this reference to show how impressive it is. And as a matter of fact, as we speak, is they are holding a conference in Bahrain at a 5-star hotel, Al Khalij, to show how wonderful is Bahrain experience in this and how brilliant it is. The truth is here. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about international bodies. It's either you come from the view of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, who also viewed the real charges against those human rights defenders, the true charges that we heard Josh elegant description about how the Bahraini court functioned, and in many cases it's just like it's really an insult. Sometimes you really don't need to say anything about the conviction. All you need to go is, as Josh said, just quote the court, the judge. You see how humiliating sometimes it is. It's sometimes it's also like you say, like, oh, to understand how stupid is this, like how, to what level, how the people gonna view their justification, how low they would be viewed. Yeah, so it's a really difficult. So we have to go back into the key question, and this is a question which the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I really urge everyone to look into the opinions declared by that credible body. And I also like to say that the UN Working Group, the way how they function is not only they take the one source or one side of the story, they take the information from the source, they present them before the government, and then based on the government's response and the original submission by the source, they will form their opinion. Their opinion on Bahrain, like there would be no year you wouldn't hear about like the decisions which were made, and then in some cases now it's also like death penalty cases, like Muhammad Ramadan and Hussein Musa, both of them are on death row. The working group has categorized more than one category under their 6 or 5 categories, more than one category about their unlawful. So if a human rights defender who did not commit a crime to begin with, and you offer him, instead of facing them unconditionally, you say to them, out of a small prison, with this prison which could even can leave the prison, there these conditions, or as in a bigger prison. And I think we could send you back by many individuals that this is a very serious issue, that we would bring this smaller prison into a bigger prison. I always talk to the individual, up to the person. If the person believes that, okay, we try them, there is nothing stopping that. But we as activists, or as UN, or as in the case of rights organizations, if they see there is a clear violations of the due process, then the message and the call should be always from our side to be unconditional and immediate release. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sayyid Ahmed. So if we don't have anyone else who would like to comment on the alternative sentencing reform, we will go on to the concluding remarks by all of the speakers in the same order as we started. Sayyid Ahmed.
Thank you. It's me again. Thank you. Yeah. Talk about human rights. Extremely important to note that these human rights to the world and to Bahrain are the one which supposed to be protecting the vulnerables. What we're seeing here in Bahrain is we're seeing them to be not protected. They, the one which protect the defenseless, are the one which are subjected to the most horrifying abuses. And the signal is would be that if Bahrain would think about this, like if we can get away not only with abusing others, but also for those which defends the human rights, then who can stop us? And it's a very dangerous message. So I do believe that there is a far bigger obligation, is that we have to prove to Bahrain that missing and abusing or imprisoning human rights defenders will come with consequences, and that will and those consequences would be very much not comfortable for your reputation, and this is going to be a headache until you find a resolution for them. I do think that this is a fight of a will, and I think we should not really like feel like, oh, it's 12 years or 11 years, we should give up. This is an important struggle, and it should not end until we ensure that not a single human rights defender is suffering behind bars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sayyid Ahmed. Next, we have Joey.
Yeah, I mean, just to conclude is that I think we as the international community have an obligation and a responsibility to tirelessly pressure and publicly shame the Bahraini government into releasing these imprisoned human rights defenders, but almost even more importantly than that, to pressure our own states and our own governments, depending on where we're from, into pressuring the Bahraini government, because there are huge security and strategic relationships between European states, the US, the UK. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm a bit sick. That, and these relationships really help to facilitate the abuse that happens in Bahrain. If there's no, public condemnation of the imprisonment of these human rights defenders, or of the torture, or of the other abuses that we have documented time and time again, then these states risk complicity in the abuses themselves. And so I think as the international community, we have a responsibility and obligation to tirelessly pressure our own state governments into pressuring the Bahraini government to change their behavior and adhere to the most minimum standards of their human rights obligations. And obviously this is a really long road. It's not going to happen overnight. There is no timeline for it, but that is really our duty. Yeah, I'll end with that.
Thank you, Joey. Sima, do you have any concluding remarks before we end our discussion?
No, similarly to my colleagues, yes, we have to continue to be the voice of these voiceless people, or those who the Bahraini authorities think they have they have silenced. We will carry on working on their cases until the end. And yes, partnering and joining hands like we are at the moment is definitely the way forward, and we will not stop pressuring the Bahraini authorities to right these wrongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Sima. Joshua, I see you already.
Let me mention for a moment the alternative sentencing laws that were just discussed to underscore a larger point. In theory, the alternative sentencing laws are a positive thing. In theory, most laws in Bahrain, not all, but most, are perfectly legitimate as written. The problem is that without an independent judiciary, it really doesn't matter how good the law looks on paper. Eventually, the legal process will become a political process. And that's why it's so important for the creative advocates we have here today to continue doing the extra legal work that they have been, because plainly there's no reasonable expectation that people will receive fair treatment within the court system itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua. Sara?
Thank you. No, definitely agree with all of the other panelists. And what I also wanted to add is that we're also trying to reach beyond governments to ensure that the private sector also takes responsibility, because if we look at the case of Denmark, the situation is that many very big private companies have extensive production and exports to Bahrain. And so for that reason, we really need their solidarity and efforts as well to take a stance against authoritarianism and against countries that they export to that are really, really doing very horrendous things, such as we see in Bahrain. And so for that reason, we hope that the private sector can also play a role, because money talks, and we see export being one of the reasons why governments are not interested in calling out the Bahraini government. And this is something that I hope we can break as a cycle. We're seeing it now with Russia, and hopefully some of that can also take place with regards to Bahrain. Lastly, I just want to say that it's really really remarkable how we continue to see the bravery of Abdulhadi al-Khawaja, but also other human rights defenders in prison in Bahrain. Just a month ago, Abdulhadi staged a protest in prison because one of the prison guards that had been torturing other cellmates were now being placed to be the guard for their cell. And so this, of course, is another form of torture to really continue the presence of one of the people that have been responsible for their torture. And so Abdulhadi staged a protest where he sat down with the minister of torture. And that just comes to show how, with all that he has been through, the torture he has endured, the multiple hunger strikes, and also the different reprisals he faced in prison, we see how he continues. And I think that is inspiration for all of us to really do whatever we can to stand side by side with them. He has later then been denied medical treatment, and he has also had cuts to his calls with family. And this shows that he's willing to go over and beyond, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And so I really hope that we will all sort of join hands continuously to stand with him and the other human rights defenders, that just to continue to be very inspirational. And lastly, thank you to everyone for your support for the Free Al-Khawaja campaign. And thank you for continuing to join us in the calls for his release.
Thank you so much, Sara, and thank you all for your inputs and for your final messages. I think that the main message that everyone highlighted is that we cannot be discouraged, and we cannot be discouraged by the last decade and by the silence, and that it's important to continue working as we have, and putting even more pressure on the Bahraini government and on our own governments in Europe to finally release the human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience. Thank you so much, everyone. I will go ahead and end the discussion if no one else has anything. Thank you.
Thank you.